the U.S. So that sounds like a big job. Frank Sapio. Frank also works for the U.S. Forest Service. And he is the Assistant Director of Forest Health Protection with state and private forestry. And he leads 2 Washington office detached units, and he's located in the building behind here, right? With the role of fostering the use of technologies to improve the health of the nation's forest, and 2 programs within Frank's group, specifically on invasive species, are the Invasive Species Information Program and the Biocontrol Biopesticides Program. So, and we have Robert Walters. So Robert manages Colorado Park and Wildlife Watercraft Inspection and Decontamination Program. And the primary mission of this program is to protect wildlife, recreation, natural resources, infrastructure, and the economy, just a few things there, by preventing the introduction of zebra and quagga mussels and other invasive species. And then we have Casey Cisneros. Did I say your name correctly? Okay, Casey is the Land Stewardship Manager for Larimer County Department of Natural Resources. And prior to his current position, his primary focus was noxious and troublesome weed management on county-managed open space. And he also serves on the Central Rockies chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration Board of Directors. Is that correct? Okay. And then last but definitely not least, Bill Nye, the science guy. Now it says Bill. On here, though, it says his name's not actually Nye, Whitaker. And Bill is a policy advisor for public lands and agriculture for Western Governors Association, an instrument of the governors for bipartisan policy development, information sharing, and collective action on issues of critical importance to the Western United States. And Bill is currently leading a 3-year Western Governance Association initiative to improve interagency invasive species data management and exchange in the West. So we've organized this as a panel. So starting with Jeff, he'll do a few slides and an overview of the topic. And then after the introductions, we'll continue this by having the conversation by having panelists weigh in on a pair of prepared questions. So thank you. So Jeff? So should he use this microphone?
I want to thank the seminar series for the invitation to reaching out to the invasive species contingent through the National Invasive Species Council and otherwise be a part of this. I think that it's clear that social license as well as societal kind of considerations are important for whatever we do to control invasive species. So it's not just the science and the biology of it, but it's sort of, kind of in the place of the society where that management action occurs that's critical and important. So it's neat to be a part of this series. We were going to talk about kind of how invasive species don't respect jurisdictional boundaries, and as such, proper management is going to require working across jurisdictions and working across different boundaries. The panelists have already introduced. I'll sort of just show that there. That was for completeness, and we can go back to that. The national definition, or at least the federal definition, based on Executive Order 13751, says that means with regards to a particular ecosystem, a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. So there's 2 things to notice about that is that it does specifically say non-natives. Some people consider natives. There are invasives or problematic species that are native, but the National Invasive Species Council focuses on non-natives, and that there is that anthropogenic or human dimension that is causing harm. So this is not something you can run a DNA test or some sort of something to look in a microscope to see if this is an invasive species. You need to understand the expectation of the ecosystem and ecosystem services, and if it's harming that, it's considered to be invasive. So there's an admittedly human dimension to that definition. The policy of the U.S. in that same executive order that they should prevent the introduction, establishment, and spread of invasives, as well as eradicate and control populations that have already been here. So there is this policy statement, and in fact 13 different agencies as well as 3 White House offices are mandated by this order to control and manage invasives under that guidance. The National Invasive Species Council, sort of trying to show the logos there of the different agencies, is the most all-encompassing. It does not include energy, although we have worked with people at Department of Energy, but it brings in most of the federal agencies you would imagine, and maybe even some that you hadn't imagined, like NASA, to consider invasive species. There are other entities. There's the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force. There's FICMANU, the Federal Interagency Committee on the Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds, and those are kind of shown in the blue and the green boxes there, and different groups that comprise those entities. But the point of this slide is really that the National Invasive Species Council and the day-to-day operations are with the Secretariat, try to manage across all that and coordinate the things that are happening with plants, animals, or pathogens, and tries to take that whole and higher level, holistic and higher level kind of policy and planning. And the reason I have been kind of allowed to work out here from Fort Collins, in part, is because of the land management that's happening in the West. Clearly, that's where most of the federal lands are, is out west. A lot of folks, boots on the ground, people that are working on those federal lands, and the panelists represent quite a bit of that, is out west. So there's a connection through that. There's also a lot with respect to federal labs that are doing research related to invasive species and working on it. That's what this slide shows. And so trying to connect that and a community of practice that's going to bring together that research with the people actually doing invasive species management. And so this conversation is kind of an excellent example of trying to make those connections. One of the things, if you go to our website, you'll see that the advisory committee for the National Invasive Species Council has written this white paper about strengthening federal-state coordination. Used case studies to derive sort of a general list of conclusions. One of those is that the departments need to engage in support of emerging state, tribal, and local partnerships that address the multi-jurisdictional issues with invasive species. So it's kind of part of that executive order that we need to control lands across those 13 agencies, control invasives across those 13 agencies, and it was part of this advisory committee suggestion that we work multi-jurisdictional as well. So that was it for an overview. So I will now maybe just go back to the panelists.
Great, thank you everybody. And so after that introduction, as we said in the beginning, we're going to run through a couple questions, and we have a set of prepared questions to stimulate dialogue, but we're also more than welcome to take questions from the audience, either in person or through the chat box online. And so this is going to be a relatively free format. We'll throw out a question and then just pass the mic around among the panelists to have hopefully a pretty good discussion. So without further ado, I'll jump into a list of questions here. I'm sure the panelists are anxiously awaiting to see what I pick. So the first question is, the panelists all are kind of coming at the problem of invasive species from different levels of it being involved in their job. So some people it's full-time, other people it seems to be a part of it. And so I guess coming from the perspective of how much your job is devoted towards invasive species, how do you and your organization manage invasive species in the context of larger issues or other issues that might be competing for your resources, including time? So with that easy question, I'm going to pass the mic to
whoever wants to jump on it.
I guess I'll start. One of the ways that the Western governors look at invasive species, and the easier way that we can devote more time to it, I guess to answer your original question then. So within WGA, we've got a staff of 15, and I am the dedicated invasive species policy person. I'd say the way we generally operate, it's sort of feast or famine, so sometimes we'll work on a policy issue. I'll be working on it 90% of my time, and sometimes I won't be as much, but fortunately right now, 80% of my time is dedicated to invasive species. And I think part of the reason is because there's so many ways that invasive species can correlate and are related to other invasive species or other land management issues. So it's easy to tie invasive species management into fire management and into endangered species management and into just general rangeland and forest management. So I think that's my way to sort of insert myself into conversations that I might not be wanted in, is by bringing it back to invasive species. So it's easy to, when you look at it from a broader landscape perspective, which is what WGA is pretty big on, it's easy to shoehorn some invasive species conversations into that.
And we'll go just on down the line. This is Jeff saying that invasives is the full-time job for the National Invasive Species Council, but maybe one of the things we do have to juggle is kind of this multi-jurisdiction and science and policy and management, and how much you dedicate to any of those given domains of the invasive species issue. And I think that it's great to have Bill here, and it's good that there's this WGA initiative. I think there's a lot of value in kind of that leverage and voice of WGA that's sort of more on a state level than the feds coming down trying to say something dictated to the local managers. And it's at kind of the sweet spot, because it's kind of hard, I think, for a federal agency or federal activities to connect to, all the counties that are out there and even all the states and all the cities. So it's a little bit harder to figure out where you connect with any local manager. And I think WGA is an interesting kind of catalyst in that connection between Fed, state, and local. And I think that, but working with the more local activities on a county or in a sort of city and a given state, is you prioritize maybe where there's an example where that could be kind of lessons learned for other states and other counties. So what we can pick up from that in a general kind of context of learning, and then extending and expanding that to other local activities.
This is a pretty easy one for me as the invasive species specialist for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I spend 100% of my working hours and many of my non-working hours working on invasive species issues. When we're looking at things like zebra and quagga mussels that have the potential to cause billions of dollars in damage to our natural resources and the infrastructure here of the state, I think it's a very wise move on behalf of the state of Colorado to have some full-time salaried employees who focus entirely on these issues.
This is Frank Sapio with Forest Health Protection, the USDA Forest Service. I think depending on where you are in the U.S. Forest Service, there's a different answer. So I'm going to answer specifically for state and private forestry. We don't specifically address just invasive species. Our authorizing legislation comes from the forest protection side. So we administer many invasive species programs, but they develop based on input that we get from the field, based on input that we get from the user community. We administer a series of special funding programs. Many of you have heard of them: STDP, Evaluation Monitoring, Forest Service Pesticide Impact Assessment Program, and Biocontrol for Invasive Plants. I may have missed one. But those programs are not only to push money out to the field to do good work, much of that in invasive species is to solicit input that eventually we build programs around. Emerald ash borer, Cyrex noctilio, Polyphagus shothole borer in California, laurel wilt in the south, gypsy moth, hemlock woolly adelgid. It's my home state of Michigan, frightens me. These came from some of these funding programs. These came from local interest from states, letters from governors. Programs are born various ways, but we are very bug or disease or plant-centric in FHP. I'm not sure that's a great way to organize a program, but it is how it happens. And it's a reaction to our authorizing legislation.
This is Casey with Larimer County. My expertise really lies within noxious weed management, so I'm going to focus on that more than tree pests. Within Larimer County, the way that we prioritize noxious weeds and invasive plant species is we start by looking at what the Colorado Department of Agriculture has listed as their priorities. We do go after List A species first and foremost on private and public lands. And depending on the year and the funding source, we either can go out and take care of those issues on our own, or we leave it to the landowners or the land managers to respond to those. At the next level of List B, we try to focus on the plants that are outside of the suppression boundaries and treat them like List A species and try to eradicate them. And then within the boundaries, we try to keep them from spreading more. We also take into account a lot of the local landowner needs and management goals on their specific sites. So on open space that's managed by the county, we may have different priorities in funding that guides our management as opposed to on private lands.
Great. So one of the things that I heard is that there does seem to be a fair amount of crosstalk between different agencies, different stakeholders. But one of the other questions related to that is, what are some of your organization's greatest obstacles to further collaboration or coordination with other invasive species managers? Or do you feel like this is an area that doesn't necessarily need further addressing? I mean, wanna switch on my mind?
This might sound like a cop-out, I suppose at some level it is, but when I joined the organization, I was a former state of Michigan employee. 15 years ago, we were approaching $137 million as an organization. We're barely scraping 60 now. So that's the biggest impediment to collaboration, because pushing money out to the field is what we do in state private forestry. That sounds a little crass, but that is in effect what we do. So it's the fuel that makes things work.
I would say the obstacles for us, I think one of the things, this has been with WGA, one of the things that we work on is, one of the biggest obstacles that we have is just different state statutes on invasive species, and particularly the data around invasive species. In the 22 states that we work on, there's different levels of statutes saying how much information you can share with adjacent states. And in some states, because it relates to private landowner rights, and some states have more strict laws related to species and threatened and endangered species information. Sometimes it can get to where state A can't communicate any invasive species occurrence data, or they have severe limitations on it to state B or to the federal government or things like that. And when we're trying to look at invasive species from a landscape level view, it's really difficult. Invasive species don't pay attention to boundaries, but jurisdictions and agencies do. So that's a big one. And just the thing you hear all over again and again, anyone who talked about this, is a lack of capacity. There's only so much you can do with a limited staff and a limited amount of resources. There's invasive species is such a huge problem. You could quadruple the funds we have now, and it's still going to be a problem. So it's just doing what you can with a limited group, a limited number of resources.
Hi, Robert here with Parks and Wildlife. So when we're dealing with water bodies, these are very complicated situations as to who has jurisdiction over the water, who has ownership of that water, who's the recreation manager at those waters. So we usually have very good working groups established for each one of these different water bodies, and we very often meet and come together as to how we are going to do our best to protect these waters from the invasion from invasive species. And when I'm walking and talking in these groups, I never feel like the people in that group don't feel that this is an important issue. They all want to participate in what it is that we're doing, but at the end of the day, the limiting resource typically is just funding in most situations. People want to help, they want to contribute, they see the value in the long term of keeping these species out of the water, but today they don't have the funding to contribute to these programs. So that is a very limiting factor from our perspective.
Yeah, funding is a big issue to overcome with respects to invasive species management across jurisdictional boundaries. But I recently have been focusing on varying priorities depending on agency. So not every agency shares the same priorities, even if it is outlined by the state of Colorado or by some kind of federal mandate or executive order. It seems like everybody sort of picks and chooses their projects, and probably rightfully so. They have good reasons to do so, but because my priorities differ from the neighboring landowner's priorities, then it's hard to get on the same page and work on these issues across jurisdictional lines.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the challenges that we observe at the National Invasive Species Council Secretariat, looking out over 13 agencies, is that each agency has its mandate and its priorities and what it's supposed to do. And so that kind of causes, that difference in how people are going to prioritize their actions. One of the things I think is a barrier that we maybe can overcome, or where it's sort of low-hanging fruit, is to think about, there's some of it's just inertia, and people kind of go to work and get their work done and they kind of move along. And I think this conversation is kind of part of, maybe every now and then you got to look up and go, oh, you're doing something, and maybe we could think about some cross collaboration or some mutual sort of benefit of either sharing data or learning from experience, and bring that to kind of each other, probably in more of a grassroots kind of bottom-up approach. And so that's part of what we're trying to do with the meetups and having these a community of practice, is to get people every now and then to kind of look around and see who else is doing what. And in this the finite resources is going to be hard to overcome. I don't know. I don't see big funding coming at the end of the day, kind of anytime in the near future. So I think we got to make do with what we have, and so we got to try to think about working kind of more collaboratively, maybe a little bit smarter. One of the things that might help with respect to that funding source, or communicating into making more progress, to me, is to think about what it is that we care about, focus on those things, and then talk about how invasive species are vulnerable to those things. So that, I think, for 15 or so years, invasive species has been a major topic, kind of in the literature, and then in these specific fields. And I think, as Robert was saying, you work all day, you do a really great job making sure nothing happens, and you stay off the newspaper, and you don't have the big splash that the mussel was found in these reservoirs. That's when you're doing good. And I think that causes a bit of a barrier to be like, you're effective. That means you're out of the radar. We're kind of a reactionary society. Government tends to be, kind of respond to emergencies, or the fire that's kind of breathing down your neck, literally or figuratively. So how can we connect? And maybe this is a question to WGA to think about, what is it that matters to people? What do people care about? And then we can start to say, it's invasive species that are threatening those. So we need to sort of have that awareness and resource pool dedicated to invasives to help protect what you do care about.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that's a really good point. I think one obstacle is a lot of what WGA does too, is try to advocate to Congress and the administration for greater attention and greater funding to invasive species. And it can be one obstacle, is that sometimes I think that the numbers associated with invasive species invasions are just so staggering that once a number, like a line item in a budget gets so big, it's not even real anymore. So, quag and zebra mussel invasion in the Columbia River Basin is $500 million annually just to manage that. And I think sometimes it's hard to engage people and get people's interest and Congress's interest in something like that. So I do think there's a benefit in looking at resources, what this means to economically and ecologically and culturally to an area. If you look at ranching, say what, in so many Western communities, ranching is a major part of the culture, identity, and economy. And if invasive cheatgrass has a major impact on that, that impacts lots of resources at lots of different levels. So that's one way I think that, ranching is an example that the way that WGA is advocates and our policies on that is just to look at sometimes through the cultural impacts that it can have to these Western communities.
I'm curious if the group, if the audience is, or anybody online.
Yeah, so that dovetailed with another question that we had brainstormed ahead of time, and as Jeff's answer was kind of talking about, is that when things are going right with invasive species, there's a little attention. So he mentioned some of the ways that we can try to keep the inertia going and keep the momentum by tying things to other things that people care about. But at this point, we might want to throw it out to the audience if people have any ideas for discussion of other ways that we might be able to keep some of the attention on invasive species, keep this as a priority. Or any other panelists?
There's a lot of expertise in the room. I'm kind of just being shy.
Right. Well, I find that although it's hard sometimes, you have to do a lot of shameless self-promotion of your program. And what you need to focus on is numbers and figures so that key decision makers who know nothing about invasive species can say, wow, that program's working, or this would be a good way to put more money on the ground and get a bigger impact in the future.
So as part of that, I in the back of my head, I keep thinking of this question. This seminar series, Interactions of the Environment and Society, and this is obviously, by definition, a place where the environment and society come together. So I was wondering, though, with respect to the human part of things, do you use much social data to either try to set your priorities or to show impacts of the work you do, be it just general social data or economic data, or like, how do you tell those stories?
Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize the microphone, but with our organization, we do site visits and free site visits with the public, and all of our information, our office is available for people to call in and complain about noxious weed issues around Larimer County. And we hear a lot of feedback from citizens. We try to track those sentiments. We have a workflow tracking system. And so with those phone calls, complaints, landowner concerns, we try to take those into account. In fact, in my position, I feel like I get more pressure from landowners that are neighboring other lands that the noxious weeds are not being dealt with, and they want to see us do something with the neighbor than the people who we send letters to remind them of their responsibilities to manage noxious weeds. They typically just, on average, don't know about that responsibility. And that was eye-opening for me when I moved into this position about 1.5 years ago. I figured it'd be the other way around. Every time I sent a letter, I would probably hear from the person on the other end yelling at me about it.
I think in FHP, we engage in social process, but we're not analytical about data. We're very sensitive to cooperators' needs. We think we're in touch with those needs. But as an analyst, myself, I don't think we approach that in any kind of analytical way. And we haven't had an economist. We used to have an economist on the staff, I think 12 years ago. He retired when think we lost any hope of that kind of approach back then. But we're talking about it now. I think we see the development of some of these programs within the Forest Service, and I think there's an understanding that it's a void within the expertise within the staff. That's a start.
I certainly think that talking with the public and communicating to them how some of these issues may affect them personally has been one of our most successful tools for gaining support for our program. You can tell someone 1,000 times over that something like a zebra or quagga mussel is going to personally impact some recreationist or someone that wants to use the waters. But the response that I really get is when I show somebody a mussel-encrusted prop and say, this is your boat, and this is going to cost you personally thousands of dollars if these infestations do occur, and beyond that, you're going to lose access to this water body if these do happen to make it into one of these locations. So I do certainly say that personalizing that type of information and addressing how it would be a personal impact to the users is a very effective communication tool.
This is why it's great to have a panel, because I'm a scientist in a federal lab or a federal agency, so I don't talk to anybody. Not quite, but it's great to have that local connection of people who are interfacing with the public. But from the science perspective, I think there has been some recent papers in kind of social license or the social dimensions of invasive species control, and there's been some literature on not just risk assessment but risk management. So not only is it kind of a risk and this is how you could control it, kind of that seems to be done, a lot of this risk analysis without considering that it's going to be done in the context of a society, and so there are going to be costs involved with that management, not just its effectiveness, and there's going to be some possible backlash that needs to be considered. So I think we're seeing some literature, and I think this is maybe an opportunity for collaboration, is that scientists thinking about that need to connect with the people who are sending the letters to the public or kind of staging that education campaign at the boat inspection stations, and probably have a lot of real interesting stories and access to people to do that. So maybe that's a collective action item to think about that multi-jurisdictional and research to policy to some people on the ground, and having the opportunity to look into that a little bit more.
And this is Bill with WGA, and I think, Robert, you brought up a good point about using a visual aid or something that really shows people how it will affect them, because one thing that a prop that has been used routinely at WGA is 3 or 4 years ago, there was Governor Sandoval, Nevada, hosted a drought forum, and one of the things that came up in that is during one of this panel speeches, someone held up a Nevada license plate that was completely encrusted with zebra mussels, and that license plate has sort of made its rounds around a lot of our presentations because it's such a state license plate, so iconic, and it sort of demonstrates how under attack the state resources are. So we've used that often as a prop to discuss how dire this issue is. But beyond that, I think that just interacting with the public more generally, that's a challenge. But I think that's one of the reasons WGA has taken on the initiative that we're doing with invasives, is because part of the reason is we don't have the staff or the technical ability to really come up with any. We're not scientists. We're not going to come up with any large technical solutions to this, but the governors do have the ability to come together and have a sort of voice, put their voice like a speaker box about how this is a regional priority and a regional concern. So we've got a media team, we tweet or send out on Facebook maybe a couple times a week about invasive species. We probably tweet every half hour, and a pretty big handful of those are about invasive species. And then beyond that, with our invasive species data initiative, we're trying to get a way for the public to report invasive species data on our website. And a lot of what we're doing is not trying to replicate databases that are out there. We're just trying to get the word out, and hopefully the governors can engage at a regional level the way that independent agencies can.
Great. So a lot of the answers were kind of focusing on, I think, ways of communication and social data kind of folding into the opportunity for communication to the general public and some of the needs there. And one of the things I see looking out in the audience, I see we have a number of the natural scientists actually who work on invasive species as well. And so kind of coming from the perspective of thinking about the communication and getting word out, I'm wondering if, and you know, feel free to take this question in different directions, but I'm wondering if you feel like, from your organization's perspective, if there's a need for more communication of some of the natural science. And you're talking about the power of these stories. And do you think there are some ways that that natural science might help do your job? Or are there other areas where there might be research needs? So I guess another way to put it is, do you think there's some of the more, for helping with the tasks that you're undertaking, do you think it's more about the fundamental research, or is it about the translation of research into things that the general public will understand? Not that it needs to be one or the other.
For us, it can be both. For us, you know, we're working with getting a policy agreement on large issues between a lot of people. So every now and then, a specific document or report will be used, endorsed by the governors at a regional level, and will be used then, and so then that will be broadcast more widely. But I think generally what WGA and trying to, a lot of what we do is just trying to take research documents and put it in a language that is accessible to the public. And we do that through social media engagement. We've got a weekly email called The Best of the West that we blast out to our probably 15 or 20,000 subscribers. And in that there is usually almost weekly, there's some sort of scientific report or some sort of what's happening in natural resources and how it affects them. So that's our best engagement with science and the public is that through just, you know, a couple sentence bite, oftentimes on policy, with a link on scientific information.
I'm curious about what others are thinking.
I guess in regards to research, our invasive species program certainly prides itself on trying to stay involved and up to date on any type of research that's going on out there. We're pretty fortunate in the fact that this is a relatively limited scope, and through groups like the Western Regional Panel on Aquatic Invasive Species, we have great opportunities to remain involved in those research, see the results as they're happening, and ideally incorporate those results into our inspection, decontamination, and sampling protocols on a routine basis. That's pretty common practice within our field. I would say a little different coming from the aquatic invasive species research needs is that in many situations I feel like the research isn't out there that I would like to see in regards to how we continue to manage these species when it comes to things like vectors, like something like a ballasted boat moving from one location to another. I have not seen a definitive study out there that tells me whether or not those organisms are viable in that system, and until I see something that's definitive, peer-reviewed, and published and tested, I'm going to continue to delegate mass amounts of resources to limiting the potential for the transfer of those species through these different vector channels. So I would certainly like to engage a little more with the folks in the natural sciences and try to come up with more research opportunities to help us drive those protocol changes. Certainly open to that.
As someone who sits between the research community and the user community, I'm going to tell you that it's all about technology transfer. What my group does is we spend a lot of time developing the implementation mechanisms for various tools that come out of the research community. The simple discovery of a parasitoid for mile-a-minute weed or yellow star thistle doesn't equal an implementation of a West-wide control program for a particular invasive plant. So, I mean, rearing facilities have to be built, methodologies for rearing parasitoids, capturing them, release ratios, understanding how the particular parasitoid survives in the environment, what are its limitations. I mean, that's where the rubber meets the road. So I think there's often a gap between the research community and the user practitioner. And I don't believe there are enough groups like mine to help fill that tech transfer need, because we have way more work than I talk about what we're not doing more than I talk about what we are doing.
In my experience, the translation of research often depends upon the audience that I'm working with. On one hand, those that really enjoy the outdoors or have some science background, you can talk to them about the research and have discussions about it. One great example is the Native Plant Society. I do a lot of talks and workshops with them, and they're passionate about what they're working on, and they take that science into consideration, and then they are a great way to go out into the community, and they kind of pass that along to their neighbors, or those at festivals that they come over to the Native Plant Society booth and they have those discussions. But from a landowner or more from a private landowner perspective, I see that demonstration is often the best way to convince them that something needs to be done about noxious weeds. So we're fortunate in having an enterprise program that can go out and do contract work on private lands, and we utilize different grants to go out on private lands and apply these best practices. And after one growing season of doing that, the landowners are usually on board, and they start seeing the benefits fairly quickly of doing noxious weed management.
All right, so building on some of the answers there, which we're talking about the way that different users and different stakeholders can be kind of brought in, and that affects the need for translation. I was just kind of curious if there are any important players that you feel like are missing from these types of conversations that we're having. Whether it's landowner representatives or other agencies, other organizations, and if so, if we can just kind of brainstorm how we might engage with those players.
This is Bill with WGA. I think from our perspective, one of the hardest groups to engage with is private landowners, because especially with weed issues in the West, they can be such a large percentage of the makeup of Western lands, and there can be all sort of incentives and disincentives for them to participate in engaging with agencies and invasive species or reporting the presence of invasive species. And it's also these there's a lot of ranchers that they're busy people, and they might have time to participate with sort of the larger profile invasive species that affect their bottom line, but sort of the emerging species they might not have as much interest in, or they just can't take the time out. Or sometimes, related to threatened and endangered species, there's oftentimes just a level of fear sometimes on reporting these species on your lands because you don't know what's going to happen after you get that. And that's, there's an education component, but I wish I had a good idea or a great suggestion on how to engage with those folks, but persistence is what we've got right now, and just working, especially with weeds, with local grazing associations and state level grazing associations is one method, but there's different nonprofits that work coordinating private landowners, but I'd be interested to hear what the rest of the panelists think a good engagement method is.
Yeah, to comment, this is Jeff, to comment on kind of missing players. I think it's interesting, and I'd like to see if anyone kind of in the kind of participating in the audience or listening thinks about, this I think what Robert was saying is that he's got a lot of ideas that, kind of where research could help address some questions. I think in general, in a federal lab anyway, your priorities come from your program manager who's controlling the purse strings. In some ways, it's incumbent upon, and I think a lot of scientists do, have the initiative to check with some local initiatives. I mean, you might work with the Tamarask Coalition and you get invited to the meeting and you forge that relationship. But I think maybe there's more opportunity to explore that connection, maybe a little bit more frequently, to get that science guided by the needs that the management people, maybe locally, maybe we arrange other states, and there's the annual conferences pertaining to sort of taxa specific that we could explore, or fish and wildlife agencies. So it's just kind of maybe something to query the group too. I'm kind of interested interested in hearing from people, and as well as if anyone else on the panel has any comments.
I'm a little astounded that we don't have representation on the panel. We haven't talked about to any extent the state and federal regulatory agencies with regard to invasive species. I mean, that's a big missing piece here. And why is that?
Why is that?
I mean, they were the first people that we would talk to. Now, yeah, I'm overly bureaucratic perhaps, but just asking.
Well, in regards to the Noxious Weed Act, it's the Colorado Department of Agriculture that is the regulatory backbone to that legislation. But because they farm out most of the enforcement responsibilities to the counties and municipalities, there's this very unclear line of responsibility. And I don't know if the state looks to us counties for leadership or if we need to look more at the state, but when we approach the state on some of these issues, it often seems like, one, they don't have the resources, time, or funding to pursue the kind of outreach in regards to research that we'd like to see, and that kind of comes back on the counties. And so it's difficult, and you really do need to build partnerships and strong relationships with others, especially outside of your own department or your own focus. But it just goes back to that idea of priorities. How do you get to share those same priorities with the other agencies, especially the regulatory ones?
It might be worth mentioning that the National Invasive Species Council Secretariat has a couple of folks focused on policy, and they track every congressional action that has the terms invasive in it, whether it's sort of loosening some requirements to help control invasives or sort of just actions, funding, or resources to fight invasives. We do try to track those, and the Secretariat does produce an opinion or some documentation of that then goes out to the members that lead in this Secretariat. So there's the agency leads that are in this Secretariat. It's supposed to trickle down. So there is at least a policy, there's a big policy dimension to what the NIST Secretariat does. So just kind of worth mentioning that. A couple things I want to mention, so stick with me. The other thing we talked about in this Secretariat was to say, as far as classifying something as a watch list or a risk assessment, sort of invasive or non-invasive and alien, maybe in a database sense, anything that has some sort of control authority is an interesting way to think about it in a data sense, like sort of the A and B list or the 1 and 2 list that a state would issue as a way to say, okay, well, this is not, this isn't as subjective. We've got some credible, tangible piece of data to tie back to that it is a controlled species, and that might be something to think about in terms of databases. One final, a little bit tangential comment is that I wanted to mention at the beginning that we kind of have a finite panel, and this is certainly not exclusive. I really appreciate everybody that did come together for this, but there's Steve Ryder with the state, we with the Department of Agriculture has a lot to say about this. There's other federal labs that are doing different things. There's people in the audience that could probably talk just as eloquently or informatively about invasive. So I think it should be the part of a bigger conversation that we can continue, maybe not through this seminar series, but through this invasive species community of practice. So that's a plug to stay tuned on that and to think about these other dimensions that come up.
I just want to piggyback on that question to see if any of the other panelists want to weigh in, because one of the questions we had thought about ahead of time is what is the role, from your perspective, what is the role of those regulatory agencies? Do you feel like, well, yeah, I'll let you answer. Any thoughts? And if not, we can move on. So shifting gear a little bit, and this is based on also comments that Jess just made, I wanted to ask, how important are these authoritative databases on the distribution or density of invasive species? And are these things that you use? Where do you think these should reside? Who should maintain them? Do you have any thoughts that you might want to weigh in on that?
I think, this is Bill with WGA, the Western governors in our most recent, the Western governor's most recent invasive species policy resolution specifically mentions the importance of, they don't use the word authoritative databases, but they use regional invasive species databases, and it's a really high priority for the governors because for work we've done over the last several years engaging with invasive species stakeholders at all sorts of different levels, over and over and over again, they stress the importance of knowing where the species are and knowing where they aren't, and having that information be accessible and up to date. And it's a huge component. And I think from our perspective, from state's perspective, there is an importance, and this is part of what we're doing with our current initiative, to have there's many states that operate their own databases, and but there's not this, and then there's federal agencies that run databases for both federal agencies and for and that states and counties are welcome to participate in that. And again, there's academic institutions that run databases as well. But I think one of the things that we're concerned about doing at WGA is creating a regional level state database where states can store state data and federal agencies are welcome to do it. Because I think when we were talking the earlier question about what are the barriers, the obstacles to invasive species management, I think that's one of them is that states can be hesitant to store their invasive species data on a federal database because they don't know if the funding is going to just vanish one year, and they don't know if that's going to data is going to be held in perpetuity. And likewise, state federal agencies, for either statutory reasons or just fear that states won't provide funding as well, are hesitant to keep their data on state servers. So I think that's a big obstacle, but I think we're working to create something at a regional level and secure funding to sustain it for the long term. But in short, I think authoritative databases are extremely important.
This is Jeff chiming in that I think data is, that's the kind of first section in the science paper, and data, methods, materials, and then your results. So it's the backbone, it's the foundation of the science that we can do, requires good data. And I think that we've got a couple of exciting things, I think, that are relatively recent. You've got a long history of some successful programs. I think the EDD maps and check bars are on has kind of really established that occurrence data set and established that as kind of a go-to source. I think that citizen science and the science behind citizen science has promoted more of this collection from multiple sources. You have ArcGIS Online, which allows you to point to data that you don't have to grab and control, and it can remain fresh at that local entity that's hosting it that you're pointing to. So each state could have its own database, and they maintain that control. And we could just coordinate the access to that and looking at that, and then warning that this invasive species is now within a boundary of your next state without ever having to collect those data kind of wholesale from that state. I think iPhone technology goes a long way. Colorado has initiated this boat inspection web or phone app that sort of allows all the states that utilize it to share information on boat decontamination and inspections. And I think that the kind of now harnessing these opportunities is the challenge. One part that I don't think we've done a great job on with respect to data is keeping track of control actions and the efficacy of those control actions. I think we've done a better job with occurrence data. You got a little bit with the boat inspection, it's kind of hinting to that, but there's not a lot of databases about weed spraying and controlling and a revisit, and it's not there. That's sort of a little bit off the radar for a lot of these data initiatives that have been going on. So that's maybe an opportunity.
I would say within the scope of my work, having these national authoritative bases is absolutely critical. When we're talking about things like vector management, if I can refer to the USGS non-indigenous aquatic species database, and I can identify and verify that a watercraft is coming from one of these waters that's known to be positive, then I am going to deal with that vector in a very different fashion than if I was able to verify it's coming from somewhere that we don't know these species are present. So that is absolutely critical to us. I would say there's a lot of varying levels to these types of databases. So at that national level, you may not necessitate the level of resolution of data that you might need as you kind of move down the line from state and then to local databases. At the state level, we have things like the Colorado Department of Agriculture, who's keeping distribution data, and it's very, very important that that data is accurate and complete because they're using that data to dictate what's required in regards to management and how we have to deal with these different types of species. And if we don't have complete data sets, then those decisions aren't based on what's actually out there in the field. So it's very, very important that that information is 100% accurate wherever possible. And then as you kind of move down to the local, Jeff talks a little bit about kind of the efficacy and those things that are dealing more at the local level. I think that highest level resolution of data is really held at that local level. Those are the folks that are recording the exact location of a species, they're recording the spread within that local area, they're recording their treatment, and ideally they're coming back year after year and recording that same information. But that's a heck of a lot of data coming from a lot of local areas to try to compile into one massive resource. So you really got to look at those different levels based on what the ultimate goal is that you're trying to get out of that data. So a lot of different things there.
I want to echo what's been said. Jeff, thanks for mentioning UGA. My group, my former group, FATET, actually funded Chuck Bargeron and Keith Ducey when they started that effort. So we're pretty proud of what they've done. I can't tell you how many times in 15 years I've been to different groups, work with different consortia about developing cooperative databases. And I've forgotten them all because they all end up in the same place, no action. And I don't exactly know why that is, but I'm going to tell you a little story. We just revamped the way people who track bugs and crud on trees do their survey. We've instituted a program in all 50 states, a new collection paradigm. It's based on tablet computing, aviation, and the one thing people have to do to participate is they had to give up their data. The system is based on syncing to a centralized server where everybody can see everybody else's information. That was usually unpopular. I almost was tarred and feathered more than once. We're in about our third year now, and the participation and contribution to that system has gone up 3 times that from what the previous system allowed. People like seeing what's across the fence. We only have 2 states where laggards who haven't adopted this, and fundamentally they were the best aerial survey program in the country. But they're different values, and values they're kind of old, non-sharing values. I think it's around information is power. People like to withhold that information. But I think by sticking to it, by banging at it, we're getting by that because the participation has tripled.
From a county weed perspective, I think that a authoritative database is a very powerful tool. However, it's only as powerful as the data that's put into it. And I know from looking at county distribution maps of different noxious weeds throughout the state that the data is not always well thought out and not in some instances incomplete. There's certain counties, they don't even report noxious weeds. So then it puts counties like Larimer in a tough position because we have probably the most boots on the ground of any county in Colorado. And because we do, we report more noxious weeds than any other county. A great example this year is sulfur cinquefoil. When the when I was talking to the Department of Agriculture about their new rule for the Noxious Weed Act, they said, hey, you have a disproportionate amount of sulfur cinquefoil in your county. And they said, that's because this plant, you know, it's only 10 inches tall, it's hiding in tall grass, and you basically have to step on top of it to be able to find it. And they said, well, because you're the only county that's reporting this, we're thinking that maybe it needs to become a List A species. And we need to throw more resources at it to eradicate it. And that's not the case. In other locations throughout the state, I've seen sulfur cinquefoil. It's just being underreported. And so agencies that look at these databases as the end-all data set to dictate management for the people that are on the ground, I think that's the wrong direction to go. And to fix that, what the state really needs to do is throw money on people to go out and actually map, put these databases together, and confirm the data that they're getting from citizen scientists, from county representatives, from cities.
Well, this has been a really useful conversation, I think, and I'd like to let the panelists go because they've been sitting up here for a little over an hour, but I want to give them the chance to just kind of reflect on thoughts of how we can keep this conversation going as kind of final thoughts, if you want to wrap it up with that, and I'll just pass the mic along.
I guess the way that the Western Governors want to keep this conversation going is, like I said, we've got a multi-year initiative on invasive species data, and this is exactly the type of thing that we need to be doing. Is our goal is to try to get the governors to work collectively together on and help coordination with different agencies, different folks, different stakeholders. So we are working on that over the next couple of years, and then we run our chairman of the WGA has every year the ability to set a priority, and our current chairman is Governor Dugard of South Dakota, and he's working on workforce development. But next year is Governor Ige of Hawaii. Not quite sure what that will be, but I do know that in Hawaii, invasive species are a huge concern. So I know with Governor Ige as the chair, that'll be something that we will continue and probably increasingly engage on. And yeah, I think just always seeking out opportunities like this to work better with our partners in this.
That'll be exciting to see what Dave brings. And this is Jeff saying, I think this community of practice that we hope to kind of foster, at least in the Front Range, and use that as an example of how we can all come together and kind of from a grassroots, conversational, and just acquaintance capacity, learn from each other and maybe do some things across some jurisdictions. So we'll be watching for that with those with that exchange.
I would just say that it's very interesting to be part of a panel like this with people that are so diverse in their backgrounds and the experience that they're bringing forward. Very often in the line of work that I'm in, we get very, very focused on one particular topic and working within those working groups that we're familiar with, and it's very, very valuable to be able to get this information across and have outside input from folks that may not be so familiar with the efforts that we're putting on. So thanks, Jeff and James, for putting this together.
Yeah, I just want to say, keep up the good fight. Barriers do come down eventually. You know, I see successes all the time. I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer. I'm going to be retiring soon, and my next gig will be trying to figure out how to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes.
Bows and arrows. My plan is to just continue to build new relationships with people that I know very little about in this industry, and I hope that we can continue sharing information in the future. I'm going to go to my office tomorrow and read the white paper on federal and state coordination.
Well, let me know what you think.
All right.
Comments welcome.
All right. Thank you very much.
Great. I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for really engaging conversation. And then just the one final thought in light of keeping these